I am Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, born in the village of Domremy on the border between the duchies of Bar and Lorraine in the year 1412. A peasant girl who could not read or write, who had never held a sword before the age of 16, who had never left her village, who knew nothing of military strategy or court politics or the complex machinery of a kingdom at war. And yet, within 3 years of leaving Domremy, I had lifted the siege of Orleans, seen the King of France crowned at Reims, and changed the course of a war that had been running for nearly 100 years. I want to tell you how that is possible, because the answer is not what most people expect. I grew up in a world that was dying around me. The 100 Years' War between France and England had been grinding across the French countryside for decades by the time I was born, leaving behind burned villages, abandoned fields, starving populations, and a kingdom that was fracturing along lines that seemed impossible to repair. The English, allied with the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, controlled the north of France, including Paris. The young French Prince Charles, the Dauphin, had been declared illegitimate by his own mother in a treaty that handed the French crown to the English King Henry V. France, as an independent kingdom, was genuinely on the verge of ceasing to exist. This is the world I was born into, and the world I grew up watching from the fields of Domremy, where even our small village was not spared from the raids and the burning that marked the edges of the war. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, something began that I have spent my entire life trying to describe accurately to people who had not experienced it. I began hearing voices. Not the confused murmuring of a disordered mind. Not the kind of experience that fades with daylight and leaves you uncertain whether it happened. Clear, distinct, accompanied by light, consistent and specific in what they said and what they asked of me. I came to understand them as the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They told me that I had been chosen for a mission. That I was to go to the Dauphin Charles. That I was to raise the siege of Orleans, the last major French stronghold south of the Loire that stood between the English and the complete conquest of France. And that I was to see Charles crowned as the rightful King of France at Reims Cathedral. I am not asking you to believe what I believed. I am telling you what I experienced and what I acted on, and I am asking you to consider what it would take for a peasant girl of 16 in 15th century France to walk away from her village, travel through enemy-held territory, present herself at the court of a prince, convince that prince and his council of learned men that she had been sent by God, be given armor and a horse and command of soldiers, and then actually win. Whatever the source of what I heard, the courage it produced and the results it generated were entirely real. Getting to Charles was not simple. I first had to convince the local lord, Robert de Baudricourt, to give me an escort to the royal court. I went to him twice. He dismissed me twice. The third time I went, he gave me what I asked for, reportedly because my prediction that the French had suffered a major defeat at the Battle of the Herrings near Orleans proved accurate before his messenger could possibly have brought him news of it by conventional means. I was given an escort of 6 men and I cut my hair short, dressed in men's clothing for safety during the journey through hostile territory, and travelled across 450 kilometres of war-torn France to reach Charles at the Château de Chinon. Charles tried to test me before our meeting. He dressed as an ordinary courtier and placed another man on the throne to see if I would be fooled. I walked past the man on the throne and went directly to Charles in the crowd. How I recognized him is something that I attributed to my voices and that historians have debated ever since. What is not debated is what happened in the private conversation we had immediately afterward, a conversation that no one else was present for. Whatever I said to Charles in that room, I told him something that only he could have known. Something so private and so precise that he emerged from our meeting visibly shaken and fundamentally changed in his attitude toward me. He never revealed what I told him. Neither will I, but from that moment he supported my mission. Before I could be given command of troops, I had to be examined. Theologians at Poitiers questioned me for weeks, probing my theology, my claims, my mental state, looking for any evidence of heresy or demonic influence. Mature women examined my body to verify my virginity, which in the theology of the time was considered relevant evidence of divine favor. I passed every examination. I was given armor, a horse, a sword, and soldiers. I was 17 years old. What would you have felt in that moment? After years of hearing voices that no one else could hear, after 2 rejections and a journey through a country at war, after weeks of being questioned and examined by men who held your entire future in their judgment, to finally stand in armor with soldiers behind you and a city to save ahead of you, I felt certainty. Not the absence of fear, because I was not without fear, but the certainty that what I was doing was exactly what I had been sent to do, and that the outcome was in hands larger than mine. Orleans had been under English siege for 7 months when I arrived in late April of 1429. The French commanders there had been unable to break it. The English positions surrounding the city were strong and their forces experienced and well supplied. Within 9 days of my arrival, the siege was broken. 9 days. What had resisted the best efforts of French military commanders for 7 months was resolved in 9 days. Military historians have analysed the campaign extensively, and the explanations vary. Some credit the genuine tactical insights I contributed. Some credit the extraordinary effect my presence had on the morale of French soldiers, who had been demoralized by years of defeat and who fought with a ferocity under my standard that they had not shown under anyone else's command, and some credit a combination of both. What is certain is that the English abandoned their siege positions and withdrew, and France had a victory it had not believed possible. I was wounded during the fighting at Orleans, struck by an arrow between my neck and shoulder that went through my armor. I was taken from the field. The arrow was removed, the wound was treated, and I returned to the battle the same day. Contemporary accounts describe my return to the fighting after being wounded as having an electric effect on the French forces. I was wounded again at least once more during subsequent campaigns and continued fighting each time. The accounts that survive from soldiers who served under me describe a commander who led from the front, who wept for the dead on both sides, who heard Mass every day and required her soldiers to do the same, who refused to allow looting or the mistreatment of prisoners, and who had an absolutely unshakable conviction that what she was doing was right. After Orleans, I pushed forward with an urgency that my voices gave me and that the military commanders around me did not always share. I understood that momentum was everything, that the psychological impact of Orleans needed to be exploited immediately before the English could recover their confidence and regroup. We swept through the Loire Valley, taking English-held positions in rapid succession. At Patay, French forces routed an English army in a battle that lasted barely an hour, capturing the English commander John Fastolf's forces and breaking the reputation of English military invincibility that had been built over decades of victories. And then we marched to Reims, through territory that was technically still contested, and on the 17th of July, 1429, I stood beside Charles VII as he was crowned King of France in the cathedral where French kings had been crowned for centuries. I held my banner beside him at the altar. I had done what my voices had told me to do. I wept. What happened after the coronation is the part of my story that I find hardest to speak about, because it is the story of how the people I had saved began to fail me. Charles, now crowned and increasingly surrounded by advisors who had never wanted me there and who resented the influence and the glory that a peasant girl had accumulated at court, began to pull back from the aggressive military posture that had produced everything we had achieved. There were negotiations with Burgundy, diplomatic overtures, pauses that I believed were catastrophic mistakes. I argued. I pushed. I was not always heard. The voices had given me a timeline and a clarity that the court of a cautious king operating through committees and factions could not match. And yet the transcripts of that trial, which survive and have been studied by historians for centuries, show something remarkable. They show a young woman of no formal education holding her own against the finest theological minds the English could assemble, answering with a precision and a quickness that repeatedly frustrated her interrogators, refusing to be trapped into contradictions, and maintaining under conditions of extreme psychological and physical pressure a consistency and clarity that her judges found more troubling than a simple confession would have been. When asked whether she was in a state of God's grace, a question designed as a trap because either answer could be used against her, I gave an answer that left the court silent. If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. No trained theologian could have done better. I wonder what is going through your mind right now. Because I think most people, when they truly understand what that trial was and what it was designed to do, feel something very specific. The particular outrage that comes when you watch intelligence and courage be systematically dismantled, not by superior argument, but by superior power. I had no army behind me in that courtroom. I had no king sending ambassadors to negotiate my release. I had only what I had always had. The certainty of what I had heard and what I had done, and the refusal to pretend otherwise to save myself. I was condemned as a heretic and relapsed, heretic and sentenced to be burned alive in the marketplace of Rouen on the 30th of May, 1431. On the morning of my execution, I was dressed in women's clothing after months of imprisonment in men's clothes and taken to the stake. An English soldier made a small cross from 2 sticks and gave it to me. I held it against my chest. A Dominican friar named Martin Ladvenu held up a crucifix so I could see it as the fire was lit. The accounts of those who witnessed my death record that I called on the name of Jesus repeatedly, and that my last word was his name. I was 19 years old. The English then did something that tells you everything about how much they feared what I had been. They burned my body a second time to reduce it further, and then a third time, and then they scattered my ashes into the Seine River so that nothing remained that anyone could collect or venerate. And then they reportedly stood looking at what was left, and one of them said that they had burned a saint. The heart, according to accounts that have been passed down and debated for centuries, did not burn. Whether that is literal truth or the legend that forms around a person whose life exceeded what normal categories can contain, I leave for you to decide. 25 years after my death, Pope Calixtus III ordered a retrial. The proceedings of 1455 to 1456 examined the original trial in detail, heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including people who had known me personally, and concluded that the original trial had been conducted in violation of canonical law and that the verdict was null and void. I was officially declared innocent 478 years after my death. In 1920, I was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. The same institution that had condemned me as a heretic eventually declared me one of its saints. History contains multitudes. I am Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the peasant girl from Domremy who heard voices that no one else could hear and acted on them when acting on them meant risking everything, which it always did. And although the English burned my body 3 times and scattered my ashes in a river to make sure I disappeared completely, here I remain. In the freedom of a France that exists today, in part because of what happened at Orleans in 1429. In every person who has ever been told that their background, their education, their gender, or their age made them unqualified for what they knew they were supposed to do. In the truth that the most powerful thing in the world is not an army or a throne or a theological court. It is a person who knows with absolute certainty what they are there to do and refuses to stop until it is done.